The police arrived within 20 minutes, their arrival announced by the distant wail of sirens that seemed to shatter what remained of the afternoon's tranquility. Inspector Colleen Davies, a woman of perhaps 50 with sharp features and sharper instincts, took charge of the scene with practiced efficiency. She was not a woman given to sentimentality, and her first action was to clear the manor of all unauthorized persons, directing the garden party guests into the drawing room where they were to remain until preliminary statements could be taken. The room, which had seemed so welcoming mere hours before, now felt oppressively confined, the cheerful arrangement of flowers and refreshments taking on a macabre quality in light of the morning's tragedy. Miss Marple found herself seated in a wing-back chair near the window, a handbag resting primly on her lap, her expression one of concerned bewilderment that seemed entirely appropriate for a woman of her age who had witnessed such an unexpected turn of events. Around her, the conversations were hushed and urgent. The vicar's wife, Eleanor, kept repeating that she simply could not believe it, that Margaret had seemed perfectly well that morning when she had called to confirm the final details of the party. The headmistress, Miss Thornton, sat rigidly upright, her jaw clenched, offering no observations whatsoever to the swirling speculation. Vivian, the doctor's wife, occupied a small sofa, her hands folded in her lap with studied composure, though her foot tapped an irregular rhythm against the carpet that betrayed her underlying anxiety. Marcus Ashford stood apart from the others, his back to the room, staring out toward the gardens where police officers were beginning their preliminary examination of the grounds. His face, when glimpsed in profile, appeared to be carved from stone. It was perhaps an hour after the inspector's arrival that she emerged from the upper regions of the manor and entered the drawing room. She was accompanied by a uniformed constable and a notebook, her expression thoughtful and grave. She surveyed the assembled group with the analytical gaze of someone accustomed to reading guilt and innocence in the faces of others. "I shall need to speak with each of you individually," she announced. "But first, I require clarity on several points. Who among you observed Mrs. Ashford between 3:30 and 4 o'clock this afternoon?" The question hung in the air. No one immediately answered. Then Marcus Ashford turned from the window. She left the garden party to change clothes for dinner. She went to her dressing room alone. That was approximately 3:30. His voice was steady, but there was something rehearsed about it, as if he had prepared this statement in advance. "And when did you last see her alive, Mr. Ashford?" the inspector asked, her pen poised above her notebook. "Before the party began." "In the morning. I was in my study when she went upstairs to change." He returned his gaze to the window. Inspector Davies made a note and then turned to address the group at large. "The preliminary examination suggests that Mrs. Ashford was killed between 3:15 and 3:50. The weapon appears to be the crystal perfume bottle found beside the basin. The question before us is whether this was an accident, a tragedy resulting from a fall and an unfortunate contact with the bottle, or whether Mrs. Ashford was deliberately struck. The angle of the wound, the position of the bottle, and certain other details suggest the latter. Until such time as the coroner's report is completed, I shall be treating this as a suspicious death, if not outright murder." The words fell like stones into still water, creating ripples of reaction throughout the room. Eleanor gasped. Miss Thornton's jaw tightened further. Vivian's hands gripped each other with sudden intensity. And yet, as Miss Marple observed with her characteristic attention to detail, Marcus Ashford's expression did not change. He merely continued to gaze out toward the gardens, as if he had heard nothing of particular consequence. It was then that one of the constables appeared in the doorway and leaned toward the inspector, whispering something that caused her to look up sharply. She nodded, dismissing him, and then her attention focused once more upon the assembled group. "I have just been informed that the dressing-room window, though on the second floor, is directly above a rather substantial wisteria vine, which could, in theory, provide access to and from the room. The window was open when the body was discovered, and there are scratch marks on the frame that may or may not be significant. I should like to know if any of you observed anything unusual during the afternoon. Did anyone see anyone entering the manor?" Did anyone notice the dressing room window being open? Did anyone observe anything at all that struck them as being out of the ordinary? Miss Marple raised her hand with a small, apologetic gesture. "Inspector, if I may offer an observation, I could not help but notice, when we were summoned inside after poor Miss Hartley's discovery, that there was mud on the study room rug, fresh mud, the sort that would come from the garden. It seems rather peculiar, as the study opens directly onto the corridor, and one would not naturally track mud through that particular passage unless one had come from the gardens in quite a rush." The inspector's eyes sharpened. She directed her gaze toward the study door, which remained open, revealing the pristine carpet beyond. "Thank you, Miss Marple," she said thoughtfully. "That is precisely the sort of detail that might prove useful." She turned once more to address the group. "I shall now require individual interviews with each of you. Mr. Ashford, I should like to begin with you, if you please. The rest of you will remain here and will not leave the manor until I have determined that you are at liberty to do so." As Marcus Ashford moved to follow the inspector from the room, Miss Marple caught sight of his hand, which bore a small but distinct cut across the knuckles, the sort of wound that might have been sustained if one were struggling with someone, or perhaps if one had struck something with considerable force. She made a mental note, as she had made so many mental notes over the years, secure in the knowledge that small observations accumulated with patience often revealed the truth far more eloquently than any confession ever could. The interview with Marcus Ashford lasted approximately 40 minutes, during which the drawing-room fell into an uncomfortable silence, broken only by the occasional remark or nervous adjustment in seating. Eleanor, the vicar's wife, attempted to engage her husband in whispered conversation, but he seemed preoccupied, his attention fixed upon the window and the gathering dusk beyond. Miss Thornton, the headmistress, had retrieved a small volume of poetry from her handbag and appeared to be reading, though her eyes remained fixed upon the same page throughout, suggesting that her concentration was elsewhere entirely. Vivian occupied herself with careful examination of her fingernails, though her leg continued its anxious tapping, creating a faint but persistent rhythm that seemed to set the tone for the room's collective unease. When Inspector Davies finally emerged with Marcus Ashford in tow, his face bore the peculiar expression of a man who had recently confessed to something significant without necessary. By admitting guilt, the inspector's countenance, by contrast, revealed nothing whatsoever. She consulted her notebook, made a small notation, and then raised her eyes to survey the remaining suspects with renewed interest. "Dr. Hartwell," she said, directing her attention to the village's physician, who sat beside his younger wife with visible discomfort. "I shall require your presence next. However, before we proceed, I should like to clarify a matter that has come to my attention. You were present in the drawing-room from approximately 3:15 onward, I take it." The doctor, a man in his late 60s with the weathered appearance of someone who had practiced medicine for far too long without adequate rest, nodded slowly. "I was in the garden with several others," he confirmed. "We were discussing the roses. I did not enter the manor until after Miss Hartley raised the alarm." "And your wife?" the inspector asked, her gaze shifting to Vivian with sudden intensity. "I was also in the garden," Vivian responded, her voice steady though her hands had ceased their nervous fidgeting. "I was examining the flower arrangements." "The garden was quite busy, Inspector. Surely several people can attest to my presence there." "Indeed," Inspector Davies replied coolly, "and yet several of those present have noted that you were near the edge of the garden, somewhat removed from the main gathering, and that your attention seemed focused upon the manor rather than upon the flowers. Care to elaborate?" Before Vivian could respond, Miss Marple, who had been observing this exchange with her characteristic blend of compassion and shrewd assessment, cleared her throat delicately. "Inspector, I wonder if I might offer a perspective. When one reaches a certain age, one becomes rather observant about human behavior. I could not help but notice that Mrs. Vivian seemed genuinely interested in the roses. She was examining them with the care of someone who possesses genuine horticultural knowledge. The positioning near the manor's edge may well have been coincidental. The views of the rose garden are, after all, rather superior from that particular location." The inspector regarded Miss Marple with an expression that suggested she was not accustomed to having her line of questioning interrupted by elderly witnesses, yet something in Miss Marple's tone seemed to give her pause. She made another notation and gestured toward the doctor. "You may accompany me to the study, Dr. Hartwell. I should like to discuss your initial examination of the body and your professional opinion regarding the time of death." As the doctor stood to follow her, Vivian's composure faltered slightly, and she reached out as if to grasp his hand, before seeming to think better of it and withdrawing her gesture. The separation was telling in its own small way. Once the drawing room had settled into silence once more, Eleanor leaned toward Miss Marple with a conspiratorial whisper. "That woman is entirely unsuitable for the doctor," she murmured. "Everyone in the village knows it. He was married to Caroline for nearly 30 years, such a lovely woman, devoted to her husband and to charitable works. And then Caroline passed, barely 2 years ago, and within 6 months he had married that creature. She's interested only in his money, of course. Caroline's sister tried to warn him, but he was utterly besotted." Miss Marple listened with the patient attention that had made her such an effective listener throughout her long life. "People are often lonely after such losses," she observed gently, "and grief makes us vulnerable to consolation, whatever form it may take. Though I confess, the timing does seem rather swift. Tell me, Eleanor, do you know Mrs. Vivian well? Had she been in the village long before her marriage?" Eleanor's face bore the satisfied expression of someone who had anticipated this question. "She arrived perhaps 9 months before the marriage, ostensibly to care for her aging mother, who lived in the cottage near the church. She found employment at the doctor's surgery, working as his receptionist. Very convenient, I'm sure you'll agree. Within weeks of Caroline's death, the flirtation had become quite obvious to anyone with eyes to see. The mother, oddly enough, passed away quite suddenly just after the wedding." "Influenza," the doctor said, "though I always wondered if it was something more opportunistic, if you take my meaning." Miss Marple's pale blue eyes contained a flicker of something, not quite disapproval, but perhaps a recognition of the human capacity for creating narratives from incomplete information. "And did Mrs. Vivian's mother have family? Resources of her own?" Eleanor shook her head. "None that anyone knew of. She seemed rather poor, truth be told. Rather odd that the daughter could afford such expensive clothing and jewelry if there was no inheritance to speak of." It was at that moment that the constable who had earlier whispered to Inspector Davies appeared once more in the doorway. He looked directly at Miss Thornton, the headmistress, and spoke with quiet formality. "Miss Thornton, the inspector would like to speak with you now, if you please." Miss Thornton rose with careful deliberation, placing her poetry volume upon the chair she had occupied. As she moved toward the door, her eyes met those of Eleanor for just a fraction of a second, and in that brief moment, Miss Marple observed something pass between them, some communication that suggested a depth of connection or tension that had not been apparent before. The drawing-room door closed behind Miss Thornton, leaving the remaining suspects in Eve. And deeper silence, each seemingly absorbed in private thoughts that might have been grief, anxiety, guilt, or some combination thereof. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, which had mysteriously appeared from her handbag, her needles clicking with a quiet, rhythmic constancy that seemed almost meditative, though her mind was working through the day's events with the precision of a chess player several moves ahead of her opponents. The interview with Miss Thornton proved to be considerably longer than either of the preceding ones, extending well beyond an hour while the summer light continued its gradual retreat from the drawing-room windows. The remaining guests had begun to demonstrate signs of significant fatigue, both physical and emotional. Judith Hartley, who had been the one to discover the body, sat in a state of near catatonia, her face pale and drawn, occasionally reaching for a handkerchief to dab at her eyes, though no tears had actually formed. The vicar had attempted to offer spiritual consolation, but Judith had gently declined, preferring to sit in silence. It was nearly 8 o'clock when Miss Thornton finally emerged from the study, her expression carefully neutral, though her hands trembled slightly as she returned to her seat. She did not make eye contact with Eleanor, a fact that Miss Marple noted with the precision of someone cataloguing significant variations from expected behavior. Within moments, the constable appeared once more, this time directing his attention toward Vivian. "Mrs. Vivian Hartwell," If you would please come with me." Vivian rose with fluid grace, her composure seemingly restored, though her jawline had tightened perceptibly. As she moved past Eleanor, something unspoken seemed to pass between them, a question, perhaps, or an acknowledgement of shared knowledge. Once Vivian had departed, Eleanor herself seemed to deflate slightly. Why? Her earlier gossip replaced by something that looked remarkably like genuine anxiety. It was at this juncture that Miss Marple, guided by instinct honed over 8 decades of careful observation, decided to break her practiced silence. She set down her knitting and turned her attention fully toward Eleanor, her pale blue eyes containing an expression of such gentle understanding that Eleanor found herself speaking before she had consciously decided to do so. "You are worried about Miss Thornton," Miss Marple observed, phrasing it not as a question but as a statement of fact. Eleanor opened her mouth to deny it, then seemed to think better of the deception. "I am, actually," she admitted quietly, "though I cannot quite explain why. We have been friends for many years. She was a friend of Caroline's, you see, the doctor's first wife. They were quite close, in fact. When Caroline passed, I thought Eleanor would be devastated, but instead she seemed to draw closer to Vivian somehow. It was peculiar. They seemed to bond over their mutual interest in the doctor's well-being, or so they claimed." Miss Marple's knitting needles had resumed their quiet clicking, creating a rhythmic background to Eleanor's confession. "People form unlikely connections sometimes," she said thoughtfully, "particularly when they share certain understandings." "Tell me, Eleanor, did Miss Thornton ever marry?" Eleanor shook her head. "Never. She devoted herself entirely to her career, to education. She was quite devoted to Margaret as well, actually. They served together on several charitable committees. Though now that I think about it, their friendship seemed to have become rather strained in recent months. Margaret had been somewhat cool toward her. And Miss Thornton noticed this cooling of affection, I presume?" Miss Marple inquired gently. "I imagine that would have been quite distressing for someone of her temperament." Eleanor nodded, then seemed to realize she had been drawn into a rather detailed conversation about matters that might better have remained private. She attempted to redirect the conversation. "But surely Miss Thornton cannot be considered a suspect. She was in the garden with many others. Surely she could not have slipped away unnoticed." "One would think not," Miss Marple agreed. "And yet, human attention is often remarkably selective. When people are enjoying themselves, observing others, engaging in conversation, they frequently fail to notice significant gaps in the presence of those around them. It is rather like a magic trick, you see. The audience is so focused upon what they are being shown that they fail to observe what is being hidden." Before Eleanor could respond further, the study door opened once more, and Vivian emerged, her composure now noticeably shaken. Her hands twisted together, and she moved toward her chair with less grace than she had departed. The constable then turned his attention toward Judith Hartley. "Miss Hartley, the inspector would like to speak with you now." Judith, who seemed scarcely aware of her surroundings, rose mechanically and followed the constable from the room. As the evening deepened toward night, the pace of the interviews seemed to accelerate. Eleanor was called next, departing with visible reluctance and returning perhaps 30 minutes later with an expression suggesting she had been thoroughly interrogated. Then came the vicar, whose genial demeanor seemed to have been somewhat tested by his encounter with the inspector. By the time the interviews had concluded with the remaining guests, it was approaching 10 o'clock, and Inspector Davies emerged into the drawing room with the air of someone who had been wrestling with a complex puzzle and had yet to find the solution that satisfied. "Ed her." She surveyed the assembled group with fresh intensity. "I have now spoken with each of you," she announced. "Certain inconsistencies have emerged that require clarification. First, regarding the timeline, I have established that Mrs. Ashford was indeed in her dressing room preparing to change clothes. However, I have also established that someone, and I do not yet know who, entered that room at some point between 3:30 and 4 o'clock. There are conflicting accounts regarding who was where and when. Furthermore, I have received some rather interesting information regarding Mrs. Ashford's personal circumstances. It appears that she was considerably less content with her marriage than her public demeanor might have suggested. She had recently consulted with a solicitor regarding the possibility of divorce. Additionally, she had made significant alterations to her will just 3 weeks ago, removing her husband as primary beneficiary and naming, instead, a charitable trust in Miss Thornton's name. The revelation fell like a thunderclap. Miss Thornton's face registered genuine shock, while Marcus Ashford's expression hardened into something that might have been anger or might have been resignation. Vivian's hands resumed their nervous fidgeting. Eleanor gasped audibly, and Miss Marple, observing all of this with her characteristic attention to human reaction, noted something else entirely, something that suggested the inspector had perhaps revealed more than she intended, something that altered the geometry of motive and opportunity in ways that made the solution to Margaret's murder suddenly far more complex than anyone had yet considered. The night had grown truly dark beyond the windows, and still the investigation continued, with secrets beginning to surface like bodies rising from deep water, each one more troubling than the last. The revelation regard. Margaret's altered will seemed to transform the entire character of the investigation, shifting it from a crime of passion born of marital discord into something far more calculated and deliberate. Inspector Davies allowed the implications to settle over the room for a moment before continuing, her sharp eyes moving deliberately from one suspect to another, as if assessing their reactions with the precision of a scientist observing chemical reactions. Marcus Ashford, who had been sitting in apparent indifference, suddenly straightened in his chair, his jaw tightening visibly. "I knew nothing of any will alteration," he stated flatly. "My solicitor would have informed me of such matters. This is the first I am hearing of it." The inspector consulted her notebook with deliberate slowness. "Your solicitor, Mr. Ashford, was not consulted. Mrs. Ashford employed a different solicitor, Mr. Edmund Wells, who practices in the neighboring town. She visited his office 3 weeks ago and made the changes without informing you or anyone else of consequence. Mr. Wells has confirmed this in a statement given just this evening." She paused, allowing this information to penetrate. "This suggests, Mr. Ashford, that your wife was planning something significant, a separation, perhaps, or something more permanent. When did you last have a genuine conversation with your wife? A conversation that was not merely the exchange of domestic pleasantries?" Marcus's face had begun to flush with what appeared to be a combination of anger and humiliation. Before he could respond, Miss Thornton spoke for the first time since her own interview had concluded. "I knew nothing of this charity trust," she said, her voice steady but containing an undercurrent of emotion. "Margaret and I were friends, yes, but we were not so intimate that she would discuss her financial arrangements with me. This is deep. Lie uncomfortable. It places me in an entirely unfair position." "Does it?" the inspector asked mildly. "You were aware, I presume, that Mrs. Ashford had been cooling toward you in recent months? That she had ceased to invite you to various social functions that she had previously made a point of including you in?" Miss Thornton's composure cracked slightly. "Yes, I was aware. I did not understand why. Our friendship seemed to have become strained, but I could not discern the cause. I assumed she had simply become occupied with other concerns. And this did not distress you? This sudden withdrawal of a friend's affection?" Miss Thornton's hands gripped the arms of her chair. "Of course it distressed me. Friendship is important. But I would hardly kill someone over a cooling of relations." It was Vivian who spoke next, her voice cutting through the tension with surprising sharpness. "If we are discussing motives, Inspector, perhaps you should examine the financial situation more carefully. Margaret was planning to divorce her husband. That much is now apparent. Had she succeeded in that divorce, how much of her considerable fortune would Marcus have been entitled to? And how much might that have motivated him to prevent such a divorce by any means necessary? The accusation hung in the air, its implications clear. Marcus rose abruptly to his feet. "That is absurd, and you know it. My wife's fortune was her own. Our marriage settlement explicitly protected her assets. I would inherit nothing from her death, less than nothing, in fact, given that she has left her estate to a charity rather than to me." He turned to face the inspector directly. "What I will tell you is this. Yes, Margaret had been distant. Yes, I suspected she might be considering separation. But I would not have harmed her over it. I have my own resources. I am not a desperate man. And the cut on your And? The inspector asked quietly. The wound across your knuckles? How did that occur? Marcus glanced down at his hand as if seeing the injury for the first time. I came upon it this morning while working in my study. A letter opener, an accident. It is nothing. The inspector made a note, her expression suggesting she found his explanation entirely insufficient. At that moment, one of the constables approached and whispered something in her ear. She nodded slowly and then turned her attention back to the assembled group. I have just received information from the constables who have been examining the grounds. They have discovered something of considerable interest. There is a small garden shed, located some distance from the main paths, that contains gardening supplies and various tools. Among those tools is a pruning knife, the sort used for cutting roses and other flowers. The knife bears traces of mud and, more significantly, bears what appear to be scratches consistent with contact with the crystal perfume bottle. The blade itself shows evidence of having been recently cleaned, though not thoroughly enough to remove all traces. This suggests that the murder weapon was not the perfume bottle alone, but that the victim was struck first with the pruning knife and then with the perfume bottle, either by the same person in a frenzy of violence or by different persons acting in succession. The new revelation seemed to crystallize something in the room's atmosphere. Eleanor's face had gone very pale. Vivian's hands had resumed their nervous activity with redoubled intensity. Miss Thornton stared straight ahead as if looking at something beyond the walls of the room, and Marcus Ashford, who had resumed his seat, buried his face in his hands. It was Miss Marple who broke the silence, her voice gentle and thoughtful. "Inspector, I wonder if I might ask a question." He pruning knife. Does the constable know who typically uses such a knife? Who, in other words, would have ready access to it and would be familiar with its use? The inspector regarded Miss Marple with new respect. An excellent question, Miss Marple. According to Mr. Ashford's groundskeeper, the pruning knife is part of the regular gardening equipment used for maintaining the rose gardens. Several people would have had access to it. However, the groundskeeper has noted that the knife has been missing from the shed for approximately 2 weeks. It was not reported at the time because such tools are occasionally borrowed by other staff members without explicit permission, and the groundskeeper assumed it would eventually be returned. 2 weeks, Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully. That is a significant detail. 2 weeks is precisely the period that would have been necessary for someone to acquire the knife, to consider its utility for a particular purpose, and to plan accordingly. Tell me, Inspector, who among those present today has shown familiarity with gardening? Who has, in other words, the knowledge and experience that would be necessary to use a pruning knife effectively? The question hung in the air, and Miss Marple settled back into her chair, resuming her knitting with deliberate calm, secure in the knowledge that she had just guided the investigation toward the revelation that would ultimately expose the truth hidden beneath layers of motive, opportunity, and carefully constructed deception. Inspector Davies's eyes narrowed as she considered Miss Marple's observation, and she turned her attention to the constable who had delivered the information about the pruning knife. After a brief, whispered conversation, the constable departed once more to consult with the groundskeeper. The drawing room had fallen into that peculiar silence that accompanies moments of profound tension, when each person seems acutely aware of the weight of suspicion that might at any moment fall upon them. Eleanor had begun to fidget with her hands, twisting them together in her lap. Vivian stared at her fingernails with studied indifference, though her leg had resumed its anxious tapping with renewed vigor. Miss Thornton sat perfectly still, her face a mask of careful neutrality that suggested she was acutely aware of being observed. It was during this interval of waiting that Miss Marple, with the deliberate casualness of someone making idle conversation, turned to Eleanor and posed a seemingly innocuous question. "Eleanor, dear, tell me, when you were discussing the roses with the other guests earlier this afternoon before poor Margaret's body was discovered, did you happen to notice who among your companions seemed most knowledgeable about horticulture? Who demonstrated the sort of practical familiarity with gardening that suggests genuine experience rather than mere appreciation?" Eleanor seemed startled by the question, as if she had not expected to be addressed directly by Miss Marple at all. She opened her mouth, closed it, and then began to speak somewhat hesitantly. Well, Miss Thornton was quite knowledgeable, actually. She discussed the various species of roses with considerable authority. And, now that you mention it, she was discussing proper pruning techniques with the groundskeeper just this morning, when I happened to encounter them near the gardens. She was asking quite detailed questions about how one properly maintains the more delicate varieties. Miss Marple's knitting needles paused for just a fraction of a second before resuming their rhythmic clicking. How very interesting, she mused. And did Miss Thornton seem merely intellectually curious about such matters, or did her questions suggest a more practical intent? A desire. To understand not merely the theory but the application. Before Eleanor could answer, the constable returned and approached Inspector Davies with a fresh report. The inspector's expression shifted subtly as she received this new information, and she made several rapid notes before dismissing the constable and turning her attention back to the assembled group. I have now established that the pruning knife was indeed borrowed from the garden shed approximately 2 weeks ago. The groundskeeper recalls that it was requested by someone who expressed interest in learning proper pruning techniques. The groundskeeper assumed it would be returned within a day or two, but when it was not, he simply assumed it had been left in some corner of the gardens and forgotten about. The inspector paused, allowing this revelation to settle. What is particularly interesting is that the person who borrowed the knife made a point of asking detailed questions about its sharpness, its weight, and its effectiveness on tough plant material. The groundskeeper remembers this because such specific questions seemed unusual for someone claiming merely to be interested in learning proper technique. She closed her notebook and regarded Miss Thornton with an intensity that suggested the investigation had begun to crystallize around a particular focus. Miss Thornton, I must ask you directly, did you borrow a pruning knife from the garden shed approximately 2 weeks ago? Miss Thornton's face had gone quite pale, and her hands gripped the chair arms with noticeable force. I did borrow a knife, she admitted quietly, but not for the purpose you seem to be suggesting. I wished to experiment with proper pruning techniques on some roses I was cultivating in my own garden. It seemed foolish to purchase expensive new tools when such items were available here. And did you return this knife? The Ines. Pector pressed. It has been somewhat misplaced. I believe I left it somewhere in the gardens. I intended to return it but became preoccupied with other matters. The story sounded weak even as it was being spoken, and Miss Thornton seemed acutely aware of this inadequacy. At this point, Vivian suddenly rose to her feet, her composure finally abandoning her entirely. This is ridiculous, she exclaimed. Miss Thornton is being subjected to a line of questioning based entirely on supposition and circumstantial detail. Yes, she borrowed a knife. Yes, she was in the gardens this afternoon. But so were many of us. So, for that matter, was I. So was Eleanor. So was half the village. Unless the inspector has actual evidence, physical evidence that links Miss Thornton directly to the murder. This entire line of questioning is nothing more than a witch hunt. The vehemence of her defense seemed to surprise everyone in the room, most particularly Eleanor, whose expression suggested she had not anticipated such passionate advocacy from Vivian on behalf of Miss Thornton. Miss Marple observed this reaction with particular interest, filing it away among the many other small observations she had accumulated throughout the day. Mrs. Hartwell makes a valid point, Inspector Davies acknowledged coolly. However, I have just received word that additional evidence has come to light. The examination of Mrs. Ashford's clothing has revealed traces of soil consistent with that found in the garden shed, the shed where the pruning knife was kept. More significantly, there are traces of blood on the underside of the shelf where the knife was stored, blood that appears to have been partially wiped away. This blood will require laboratory analysis, but initial indications suggest it may belong to Mrs. Ashford. The inspector turned her full attention to Miss Thornton. Miss Thornton, I am placing you under formal arrest on suspicion of the murder of Margaret Ashford. You have the right to remain silent, and anything you say may be used in evidence against you. I must caution you that your attempts to dispose of the weapon and your lies regarding its use will do nothing to assist your position. As the constable moved forward to place Miss Thornton under arrest, Eleanor released a small, strangled cry and rose to her feet. "No," she exclaimed. "You don't understand. It wasn't. She wouldn't." But before Eleanor could complete her thought, Miss Marple raised her hand with quiet authority. "Inspector," she said gently, "I wonder if you might allow Miss Eleanor a moment to collect herself before you proceed. I suspect she may have information that could prove quite significant to your investigation." Inspector Davies paused in her proceedings, her hand raised to halt the constable who had begun to approach Miss Thornton. She regarded Miss Marple with an expression that suggested she had begun to view the elderly woman with considerably more respect than she had at the beginning of the evening. "Miss Marple," she said, "I have been conducting police investigations for nearly 30 years, and I have learned to trust my instincts. My instincts suggest that you see something in this situation that I have perhaps overlooked. I am willing to listen." Miss Marple set down her knitting with deliberate care and turned her pale blue eyes toward Eleanor, who stood trembling beside her chair, her face a portrait of internal conflict. "Eleanor, dear," Miss Marple said gently, "you are not a woman given to spontaneous outbursts. Your exclamation just now was not prompted by mere distress at Miss Thornton's arrest. It was prompted by knowledge of something significant. Something that Miss Thornton would not wish revealed, but something that conscience compels you to express. Am I correct?" Eleanor's lower lip trembled, and her eyes filled with tears. "I cannot betray her confidence," she whispered. "She is my friend. She has been my friend through some of the most difficult periods of my life. And yet," Miss Marple continued with inexorable gentleness, "if she is innocent of this crime, then revealing what you know will serve to protect her rather than condemn her. If she is guilty, then truth must eventually emerge regardless of your silence. Either way, your loyalty will be better served by candor than by deception." Eleanor sank back into her chair, her body seeming to collapse under the weight of internal struggle. The room held its breath, waiting. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. "Margaret was having an affair," she said, the words tumbling out in a rush as if she feared losing her courage before they could be fully expressed. "It began approximately 3 months ago. The man involved is someone we all know, someone respectable and married. Eleanor, Miss Thornton, discovered the affair quite by accident. She found correspondence between Margaret and this man hidden in Margaret's study. The correspondence made clear that Margaret intended to use the affair as grounds for her divorce. She intended to demand a substantial settlement from Marcus and to ensure that he was publicly humiliated by the revelation." Eleanor paused, taking a shaky breath. Miss Thornton was devastated. She had been in love with Margaret for years, you see, a quiet love, never expressed, never acted upon, but present nonetheless. When she discovered the affair, she was utterly destroyed. She felt betrayed, not merely as a friend, but as someone whose deepest affections had been rejected in favor of a man she considered beneath Margaret's notice. The drawing room had gone very still. Even Vivian's restless fidgeting had ceased. Inspector Davies made rapid notes, her expression thoughtful. "This is a motive of considerable power," the inspector observed quietly. "A woman whose love had been spurned, who discovers her beloved, has taken a lover, particularly a lover whom she considers unworthy. Such circumstances can certainly lead to violence." "Indeed they can," Miss Marple agreed. "And yet, I wonder if Eleanor might tell us more about the nature of Miss Thornton's reaction to this discovery. Did she speak of confronting Margaret? Did she express anger or something perhaps more nuanced?" Eleanor hesitated, then continued. She was devastated, but not in an angry way. She spoke of wanting to protect Margaret from making a terrible mistake. She said that Margaret was vulnerable, that she was being manipulated by this man who was seeking only to use her for his own purposes. She spoke of wanting to talk to Margaret, to help her see reason, to convince her to abandon this affair before it ruined everything. And did she have such a conversation with Margaret? Miss Marple pressed. "Did Miss Thornton speak to Margaret before today?" Eleanor's face crumpled. "Yes, 2 days ago. She went to see Margaret and they spoke for nearly an hour. I know because Margaret told me about it afterward. She said that Miss Thornton had been quite emotional. quite desperate in her attempts to convince Margaret to reconsider her plans. But Margaret seemed to find the whole thing rather amusing. She said that Miss Thornton was being overprotective, that she could manage her own affairs, that she had made her decisions and would not be swayed from them. At this revelation, Miss Thornton finally spoke, her voice steady and controlled despite her dire circumstances. "Eleanor, why did you not tell the inspector this earlier?" she asked quietly. "Why did you allow me to stand accused without defending me with the truth?" Eleanor's face was anguished. "Because I was afraid," she admitted. "Afraid that the inspector would interpret your feelings for Margaret as a motive for her murder. Afraid that your desperation to convince her not to pursue the affair would be construed as rage at her refusal. I was trying to protect you, even though in doing so, I was allowing you to be falsely arrested." Miss Marple held up her hand once more, and she turned to address Inspector Davies directly. "Inspector, I believe Miss Eleanor has now provided us with the crucial context we have been lacking. However, I wonder if you have yet identified the man with whom Margaret was having an affair. For it seems to me that this gentleman might prove to have considerably stronger motive than Miss Thornton has demonstrated. A man whose affair was about to be exposed, whose marriage was about to be destroyed, whose reputation was about to be shattered. Such a man might be moved to desperate measures indeed." The inspector's eyes widened slightly as he seemed to grasp the direction of Miss Marple's reasoning. She turned sharply toward Marcus Ashford. "Mr. Ashford, I must ask you directly. Were you aware of your wife's affair?" Marcus, who had been sitting in silence throughout Eleanor's confession, raised his head slowly. His face bore an expression of such profound weariness that it seemed to have aged him by years in the course of a single evening. "I was aware," he said quietly. "Because the man Margaret was having an affair with was not a mysterious stranger. It was someone very close to me, someone I trusted. It was my own brother, David, who lives in London and whom Margaret had been meeting in secret for the past 3 months. The revelation seemed to settle over the drawing room like a heavy fog, transforming the entire landscape of the investigation in a single moment." Inspector Davies leaned forward, her sharp eyes fixed upon Marcus with renewed intensity. "Your brother," she said slowly, allowing the implications to crystallize. "Your own brother was engaged in an affair with your wife. And you say you were aware of this?" Marcus nodded, his jaw clenched so tightly that the muscles at his temples seemed to pulse visibly. "I became aware of it approximately 6 weeks ago. Margaret was careless with her correspondence. I found letters, hotel receipts, confirmations of reservations made in false names. I confronted her about it, and she did not bother to deny it. She said she had married me for security and respectability, but that she had never truly loved me. She said that David made her feel alive in a way I never had." His voice was flat, devoid of emotion, as if he were reciting facts learned by rote rather than speaking of his own devastation. "And you did nothing?" the inspector pressed. "You simply accepted this betrayal? What was I to do?" Marcus replied with sudden, bitter force. "Leave her. The scandal would have been my own undoing as much as hers. Confront my brother? He had disappeared to London, seemed to have no intention of returning to this village. I considered confronting him directly, but to what end? The affair would have continued regardless. The damage to my reputation, to my standing in the community, would have been irreparable. I chose to wait, to see if the affair would burn itself out, if David would eventually tire of her and return to London for good. "And did Margaret inform you of her plan to divorce you?" the inspector asked. "Did she inform you that she intended to publicly expose the affair and use it as grounds for a settlement?" Marcus's face darkened further. "She informed me this morning. She said that she had consulted with a solicitor and that divorce proceedings would begin within the week. She said she intended to claim infidelity on my part, a fabrication, I assure you, and to demand a substantial portion of my assets as settlement. She also said she intended to name David publicly to ensure that his role in the affair was made clear to all." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice had dropped to barely above a whisper. "That was when I realized how much I had come to hate her. Not for the affair itself, but for her cruelty in wielding it as a weapon, for her intent to destroy me utterly, to leave me with nothing, not my reputation, not my standing, not even my dignity. Inspector Davies made rapid notes, then looked up sharply. "Mr. Ashford, I must ask you directly, where is your brother David? Is he still in London?" Marcus shook his head. "I don't know. I haven't spoken to him since I became aware of the affair. I assumed he remained in London, but I cannot confirm his whereabouts." The inspector gestured to one of the constables. "I want David Ashford located immediately. Check with London Police, railway station, hotels. I want to know where he is and when he was last in this village." As the constable departed to execute this order, Miss Marple once more set down her knitting and spoke in her characteristically gentle voice. "Inspector, I wonder if I might pose a question that occurred to me some time ago, but which only now seems relevant. This morning, when I was observing the muddy footprints in the study rug, the fresh mud that suggested someone had entered from the gardens in some haste, I could not help but notice something peculiar about those footprints. They seemed to be of two different sizes, suggesting two different people, not one." "Did your constables make note of this detail?" The inspector's expression shifted. She consulted briefly with one of her officers, who rushed from the room and returned moments later with photographs of the study rug and the muddy impressions thereon. The inspector studied these photographs carefully, then looked up with new understanding. "You are quite right, Miss Marple. There are indeed two distinct sets of footprints. One set is considerably larger than the other, suggesting a man's footprints and a woman's footprints, both entering the study at approximately the same time and exiting through the study door to the corridor." She turned her attention back to Marcus Ashford. "The cut on your hand, Mr. Ashford, the one you claimed resulted from a letter opener. I wonder if you might explain how you acquired it, for the evidence suggests that whoever struck Margaret Ashford with the pruning knife was then themselves struck by Margaret in defense, resulting in precisely the sort of wound you are displaying." Marcus's face had gone very white. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it again. At that moment, before he could formulate a response, there came a commotion from the hallway. Raised voices, the sound of a struggle, and then the study door was thrust open by one of the constables. He was accompanied by a man of perhaps 45, whose resemblance to Marcus was so striking that the family connection was immediately apparent. This clearly was David Ashford, and he appeared to have been apprehended at the railway station, attempting to board a train to London. His clothing was dishevelled, and there was a wild desperation in his eyes that spoke volumes about his state of mind. "I didn't mean to kill her," David said immediately, his words tumbling out in a rush. "I only came to talk to her, to convince her not to go through with the divorce, not to expose the affair publicly. I knew it would destroy everything, my career, my reputation, my marriage. I only wanted to make her understand the consequences of what she was doing." Inspector Davies rose to her feet. "David Ashford, I am placing you under formal arrest on suspicion of the murder of Margaret Ashford. You have the right to remain silent." As the constables guided David Ashford from the drawing room, his protests and attempted explanations seeming to fade down the corridor like the diminishing cries of a drowning man, Inspector Davies turned her attention back to the assembled group with an expression of professional satisfaction tempered by lingering uncertainty. She gestured for the constables to leave David in custody and returned her focus to those who remained. Yet Miss Marple, observing the inspector's face with the keen attention of someone who had spent decades studying human behavior, noted something that suggested the inspector's satisfaction was not entirely complete. There remained, in her expression, a thread of doubt, as if some small detail continued to trouble her professional instincts. It was this observation that prompted Miss Marple to raise her hand once more with gentle insistence. "Inspector," she said quietly, "I wonder if you would indulge an elderly woman's curiosity for just a moment longer. For while I do not doubt that David Ashford was present in this house this afternoon, and while I do not doubt that he came into conflict with Margaret Ashford, I confess that certain aspects of the timeline remain somewhat unclear to me. Perhaps you might clarify them." Inspector Davies, who seemed on the verge of concluding her investigation, paused and regarded Miss Marple with a mixture of respect and mild irritation. "Miss Marple, if you have observed something that suggests my conclusions are premature, I would be grateful to hear it." What precisely troubles you about the case as it now stands?" Miss Marple rose from her chair with deliberate slowness, moving to the window and gazing out into the darkness beyond. When she spoke, her voice carried the quality of someone thinking aloud rather than delivering a formal accusation. "It troubles me," she said, "that when David Ashford entered this house this afternoon through the garden, presumably climbing the wisteria vine to reach the second-floor window as the constables have suggested, he would have had to pass through or past the study. Yet Marcus Ashford claims to have been in the study throughout the afternoon, and no one reported seeing David enter. It troubles me further that when David and Margaret were struggling, for struggle there clearly was, given the defensive wound on David's hand and the blood traces in the garden shed, no one heard the commotion. Yet the dressing room is not so isolated that a violent struggle would be entirely silent." She turned from the window to face the inspector directly. "And it troubles me most of all that David Ashford, when he was apprehended, appeared to be making a confession that seemed rehearsed, that had the quality of a man reciting a story he had prepared in advance, rather the spontaneous admission of guilt. Tell me, Inspector, when did David Ashford arrive in this village? Was it this morning, or was it perhaps yesterday, or even earlier?" The inspector's expression shifted as she grasped the implications of Miss Marple's questions. She consulted with her constables, speaking quietly but with evident urgency. One of them departed rapidly to make inquiries. The drawing room fell into a tense silence, broken only by Eleanor's quiet weeping and the occasional sound of someone shifting in their chair. It was perhaps 5 minutes before the constable returned, with information that seemed to alter the inspector's entire understanding of the case. The railway station master had confirmed that David Ashford had indeed taken the morning train from London to Little Ashford, but that this was not his first visit in recent weeks. He had been seen at the station on 3 separate occasions over the past month, each time arriving and departing on the same day. Moreover, his London residence had been inquired about, and neighbours reported that he had not been residing there regularly, that he seemed to be dividing his time between London and some other location. Inspector Davies' jaw tightened as she absorbed this information. She turned to regard David Ashford, who had been returned to the drawing-room under guard. "You have been visiting this village more frequently than you claimed," she said flatly. "You and Margaret were continuing to meet even after Marcus discovered the affair, and this afternoon's visit was not a spontaneous attempt to convince her to abandon her divorce plans. You had arranged to meet her in advance." David's face crumpled, and he seemed to age further under the weight of this accusation. "Yes," he admitted quietly. "Margaret and I had arranged to meet this afternoon. Marcus didn't know. At least, I didn't think he did. We were planning to meet in the dressing room. I was to climb the wisteria vine, enter through the window, and we would discuss our future together. I was going to convince her to leave Marcus not for revenge or scandal, but simply to be with me. I had told my wife that I was filing for divorce. Everything was prepared." He paused, his voice becoming thick with emotion. "But when I entered through the window, I found Margaret's body already in the basin. She was already dead. There was blood everywhere. I panicked. I examined the room, searching for some sign of who had done this. I found the pruning knife in the garden shed when I attempted to flee. I realized that if I was found in the house with her dead body, I would be suspected immediately. So I left, thinking I would go to London and claim I had never been here at all." His confession hung in the air, its implications slowly unfurling like a dark flower. Miss Marple exchanged a significant glance with Miss Thornton, and then spoke once more with quiet certainty. "Inspector, I believe you may have arrested the wrong person, or rather, you have arrested someone involved, but not the person who wielded the pruning knife. Tell me, when the constables examined the dressing room, did they note whether the perfume bottle bore fingerprints? Clear, identifiable fingerprints?" The inspector consulted her notes. "The perfume bottle was handled carefully by whoever wielded it. There are no clear prints upon it. And yet," Miss Marple continued, "Miss Thornton handled it, or so we have been led to believe. Miss Thornton, who had borrowed the pruning knife, who had been in the gardens, who had every reason to wish Margaret harm. But tell me, Inspector, when you arrested Miss Thornton, Did you examine her hands carefully? Did you observe whether there was blood beneath her fingernails, blood on her clothing, blood anywhere the T would be consistent with her having struck Margaret with a blade? The inspector's expression suggested she had not conducted such an examination with the thoroughness that Miss Marple's question implied. Furthermore, Miss Marple pressed forward with gentle but inexorable logic. I wonder if you have considered who among those present today would have had both the motive and the opportunity to strike Margaret Ashford. Someone who knew about the affair, who understood its implications, who would have benefited from Margaret's death, and who possessed sufficient knowledge of the gardens to know exactly where the pruning knife was kept. Inspector Davies's eyes narrowed as she began to comprehend the direction of Miss Marple's reasoning. She turned slowly to regard each of the remaining suspects in turn, her analytical gaze pausing longest upon Vivian Hartwell, whose hands had resumed their nervous fidgeting with renewed intensity. Yet it was not Vivian upon whom Miss Marple's attention had truly focused. Instead, the elderly woman's pale blue eyes had settled upon Marcus Ashford with an expression of profound but compassionate understanding. You see, Inspector, Miss Marple continued with the gentle authority of someone delivering a truth that had long been evident to her, but which others had been too distracted to perceive. I have spent many decades observing human nature, and I have learned that the most compelling motives for murder are often not those which present themselves most obviously. We are inclined to look for passion, for rage, for the crimes of desperate love or jealous anger. And yet sometimes, the most devastating murders are committed by those whose motives are far more complex, those who act not from emotion but from calculation, not from impulse but from carefully considered necessity. She paused, allowing her gaze to rest momentarily upon Arcus, before continuing. Marcus Ashford knew of his wife's affair. Marcus Ashford knew of his wife's intention to divorce him and to expose that affair publicly. Marcus Ashford understood, with perfect clarity, that the revelation would destroy not only his own reputation and financial security, but would also bring ruin upon his brother, whom he clearly loved despite the betrayal. And Marcus Ashford possessed something that none of the other suspects possessed. He possessed intimate knowledge of his wife's habits, her schedule, her vulnerabilities. He knew precisely when she would be in her dressing room, precisely how long she would be there, and precisely how to reach her with minimal risk of observation. Inspector Davies rose to her feet, her expression hardening as she began to perceive the terrible logic of Miss Marple's deduction. She gestured to her constables. Mr. Ashford, I must ask you to account for your exact whereabouts between 3:30 and 4 o'clock this afternoon. Your earlier statement suggested you were in your study throughout, yet I have reason to believe this may not be entirely accurate. Marcus Ashford's face had gone very pale, and his hands, when he raised them, trembled visibly. Yet he did not immediately respond. Instead, it was Vivian who suddenly rose to her feet, her composure shattering entirely. "Stop!" she cried out, her voice breaking with emotion. "Stop this now. You don't understand what you're accusing him of. You don't understand the circumstances." She turned to face the inspector with desperate intensity. "Marcus came to me this morning. He told me everything. About the affair. About Margaret's intention to divorce him. About the public humiliation that awaited him. He was desperate, broken by the knowledge of what his wife intended to do. He asked me for help. He said that if Margaret could be made to disappear, if she could be removed from the equation, then perhaps there might be some way to preserve what remained of his life." She paused, her voice dropping to barely audible levels. "I told him I would help him. I told him I would speak to Miss Thornton, would convince her to do what needed to be done. I knew that Miss Thornton loved Margaret, that she would be devastated by the affair. I thought I could manipulate that love into something useful, something that could serve our purposes." The confession hung in the air like poison. Eleanor made a small sound of shock and betrayal. Miss Thornton stared at Vivian with an expression of profound hurt, and Miss Marple, observing all of this with her characteristic attention to human reaction, gently shook her head. "You are attempting to protect him," Miss Marple said quietly to Vivian. You are attempting to shoulder the blame for a crime that you did not commit, but this is a misguided loyalty, and it will not serve either of you well. Tell me, Vivienne, did you actually speak to Miss Thornton about harming Margaret? Did you actually convince Miss Thornton to commit murder? Vivienne's silence was answer enough. No, Miss Marple continued, I suspect you did not. I suspect that you spoke to Miss Thornton, that you may even have suggested such a thing, but that Miss Thornton refused categorically. Miss Thornton, for all her suffering, is not a murderer. She lacks the capacity for such violence, regardless of her emotional devastation. She turned to face Marcus Ashford directly, and when she spoke, her voice carried an undercurrent of profound sadness. Marcus, you were present in this house this afternoon. You did not remain in your study as you claimed. You made your way quietly to your wife's dressing room. You carried with you the pruning knife that you knew Miss Thornton had borrowed there. You knew she had been handling, that you knew would bear evidence of her having come into contact with it. You struck your wife with that knife. When she attempted to defend herself, when she fought back, you sustained the wound upon your hand, and then you struck her again with the perfume bottle, ensuring that she would not survive to expose your brother's affair or to destroy your carefully constructed life. Marcus Ashford's face seemed to crumble entirely. He did not attempt to deny the accusation. Instead, he simply nodded slowly, as if in acknowledgement of a truth that had become unbearable to conceal. I didn't mean to, he said quietly, his voice barely audible. I went to talk to her, to reason with her. I intended only to convince her not to go through with the divorce, not to publicly expose David's involvement. But when I saw her, when I heard her speak of her plans with such casual cruelty, something within me simply broke. I acted without thinking, and then, when I realized what I had done, I panicked. I thought if I left the knife where Miss Thornton had borrowed it, if I ensured that suspicion would fall upon her, that perhaps the truth would remain concealed. Inspector Davies's expression was grave as she instructed the constables to take Marcus Ashford into custody on a charge of murder. As he was led away, his shoulders slumped in complete defeat. Miss Marple settled back into her chair and resumed her knitting, her needles clicking with quiet precision as the drawing room fell into the heavy silence that follows the revelation of terrible truths. The drawing room seemed to exhale as Marcus Ashford was removed from its confines, leaving behind a vacuum filled only with the quiet ticking of the mantelpiece clock and the soft clicking of Miss Marple's knitting needles. The remaining guests sat in various states of emotional devastation, each processing the revelation in their own way. Eleanor wept quietly into her handkerchief, her tears seeming to flow not merely from shock but from a deeper betrayal, the recognition that she had misjudged a man she had known for years, had attributed to him virtues he had never possessed. Miss Thornton sat rigid and pale, her hands gripping the chair arms as if she feared that, without such anchoring, she might simply drift away into nothingness. The wound of knowing that she had been manipulated, that her own emotions had been weaponized against her, seemed almost as devastating as the knowledge of Margaret's death. Vivienne, stripped now of her carefully maintained composure, wept with a raw intensity that suggested a profound realization of her own culpability, even if her crime had remained largely one of intention rather than action. Dr. Hartwell sat beside his wife, his hand resting upon her shoulder in a gesture that seemed more protective than romantic, as if he were bracing her against the weight of revelations yet to come. Inspector Davies remained for perhaps another hour, taking final statements, ensuring that all details were properly documented, that the chain of evidence was unbroken and would withstand scrutiny in a court of law. She spoke with David Ashford regarding his release from custody, explaining that while he had been present at the scene and had withheld information from the police, he was not directly implicated in the murder itself, though he would likely face charges related to obstruction of justice. Throughout this final phase of the investigation, Miss Marple remained largely quiet, her knitting proceeding with its meditative rhythm, though her pale blue eyes missed nothing of the interactions occurring around her. It was only when Inspector Davies approached to take her formal statement for the record that Miss Marple set down her needles and spoke at length, explaining with meticulous clarity how she had arrived at her conclusions. She described the mud in the study, the inconsistencies in the timeline, the cut upon Marcus's hand, the peculiar chemistry between Vivian and Miss Thornton that suggested connection rather than mere acquaintance. She explained how she had observed that Marcus's knowledge of his wife's habits made him far more likely than any other suspect to know precisely when and where Margaret would be vulnerable. Most tellingly, she described how the placement of the pruning knife in the garden shed, coupled with the evidence of blood upon its storage location, suggested that someone had deliberately attempted to implicate Miss Thornton by placing the weapon where she had been known to borrow it. Inspector Davies listened to this exposition with evident respect, making copious notes and occasionally asking clarifying questions that demonstrated her sharp investigative mind. When Miss Marple had concluded, the inspector regarded her with an expression of genuine admiration. "Miss Marple," she said formally, "I must thank you. Your observations and insights proved instrumental in revealing the truth in this case. Without your intervention, I fear that Miss Thornton would have borne the weight of a crime she did not commit, and that Marcus Ashford would have successfully concealed his guilt by deflecting suspicion onto an innocent woman." Miss Marple smiled gently. "I have found, Inspector, that truth has a peculiar quality. It resists concealment not through the force of evidence alone, but through the simple fact that it exists in harmony with the natural order of things, while deception requires constant adjustment and maintenance. When one observes human behavior carefully enough, when one attends to the small inconsistencies and contradictions, the truth eventually reveals itself like a pattern emerging from what initially appears to be chaos." By the time the police had finally concluded their investigation and departed Thornfield Manor, the night had grown quite late. Eleanor excused herself first, bidding farewell to the other guests with a weariness that suggested the emotional exhaustion of the day had become physically unbearable. Dr. Hartwell and Vivian departed together, though the doctor now walked slightly ahead of his wife, as if uncertain whether he wished to remain connected to her. Judith Hartley, who had scarcely spoken throughout the evening, departed with the vicar and his wife, presumably to be taken to her home, where she might attempt to process the trauma of having discovered the body. Only Miss Thornton remained, standing at the manor's entrance as the last of the police vehicles disappeared down the long drive toward the village. She turned to Miss Marple, who had prepared to depart as well, and spoke with a voice that carried both gratitude and profound sorrow. "Thank you," Miss Thornton said simply. "Thank you for seeing the truth. I cannot imagine what might have happened had you not intervened." Miss Marple placed a gentle hand upon the younger woman's arm. "My dear, what happened today is a tragedy in multiple dimensions. A life has been lost, and the man who took that life will face serious consequences for his actions. But you have been given the gift of justice, which is not always guaranteed. I hope you will use this gift to rebuild your life, to find peace within yourself. The love you carried for Margaret, however unrequited it may have been, speaks to the capacity of your heart. Do not allow today's events to close that heart entirely." As Miss Marple made her way back to her cottage in St. Mary Mead, the village seemed to have returned to its familiar quietness, though the events of the day had fundamentally altered its character. The garden party at Thornfield Manor would be remembered not as a pleasant social gathering, but as the backdrop for a murder that had exposed the fragility of reputation, the destructive power of betrayal, and the lengths to which people will go to protect themselves from exposure and shame. Yet as Miss Marple settled into her favorite chair with her knitting, reflecting upon the day's events, she found herself contemplating not the darkness that had been revealed, but the resilience of human nature itself. Eleanor would find her faith challenged, but ultimately deepened by what she had witnessed. Miss Thornton would eventually move beyond her devastation and build a new life, perhaps one less colored by unrequited passion. Even Vivian, chastened by her own complicity in the conspiracy against Margaret, might find redemption through genuine reform. And in the village itself, people would gradually return to their ordinary lives, their understanding of human nature subtly but permanently altered by the knowledge that even the most respectable facades can conceal profound darkness. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly in the gathering twilight, and she smiled to herself with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had spent a lifetime seeking truth and had once again found it. secure in the knowledge that in a world of confusion and deception, careful observation and patient reasoning could still illuminate the path toward justice.